Hello, class. I'm going to spend a little time with you and explain to you some basics about the Electoral College. And eventually, we'll take a look at the last presidential election and the final results of the presidential election in 2020. So let's get going here. So, first off, the U.S. Constitution is what mandates that we have an Electoral College. This is not something created by a political party or something created by Congress. This is actually in the Constitution. And in order to remove it from the Constitution, this Electoral College process, it would require an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and that's very hard to do. There's not enough people in the U.S. in 2023 when I'm making this video that's screaming about the Electoral College. There are many people upset about it. They don't understand it, but my students don't have to be in that category. So my intent here is to explain to you, among other things, what it actually is, why it's created, and how it functions. And then we'll take a closer look at Texas. So the U.S. Constitution and electing the president. So let's look first off at the rationale, the reason the framers put it in there, because as I've said, it's been in the Constitution since they put together the Constitution in 1787, and then in 1789, all 13 of those original states ratified the Constitution. So they accepted this idea. But let me get to some of the rationale as to why we do this. So I guess I should start off by this part by saying that we don't directly elect the president. I'm sure most of you all, if not many of you all, or all of you all know that. Our votes count, and I'm going to explain to you how we indirectly elect the president. The Electoral College, or the person who manages the executive branch, or is the chief executive over the executive branch, that person has never been directly elected by we the people, and there is the reason for that. So let's take a closer look at the reasons for that. First off, the framers in 1787 were very concerned that the person who serves as the manager of the executive branch, or the chief executive officer of the executive branch, be selected by people who were in the know. That is, people who were, some people refer to them as political elites. Others would say that they're just people with lots of knowledge about about politics, and in the know about what actually is important regarding politics. Now, there are some folks who say today that that doesn't really matter much, because now that we have the internet and television and all other forms of ways to get information about politics, that rationale is gone. But I disagree with that statement, or with that position, because there's been plenty of studies to show that just because, for instance, we have cable TV or satellite TV, 400 channels, doesn't mean that because we have 400 channels and 20 of them have to do with politics, that people actually zero in on those 20. They do not. The increase of information doesn't mean that that people actually go there and try to find that information. There's some interesting studies about who is and who is not interested in politics. Some folks, there are some universities actually that teach classes to say that people who are politically active or politically interested, there may be some genetics involved. I don't know that I buy into that, but there are some courses that are being taught that is the effect of it, that you're interested in politics or you're uninterested in politics. It's a matter of genetics. I've seen plenty of interest, or plenty of examples and evidence that may not be the case. Nonetheless, they've got reasons for stating that position. So again, going back to this, there was a real concern that whoever the president be, that they not be chosen by the people directly. Now let's look at something else too. The way that the Constitution sets up this Electoral College, and I'll use the language of James Madison, it's actually about the states electing the president. And I know that people in the United States of America today, they don't really see it that way, because I think there's a misunderstanding. But if you take a look at the actual wording of the Constitution, and if you look at what Madison had to say, who's the chief architect of the Constitution and was right there when this Electoral College institution was debated in 1787, he writes just a few months later that we need to be looking at the election of the president as an election by the states. The states decide, state by state by state, who is going to manage the executive branch of the national government for a 4-year period. That is that's his explanation, one of the chief important explanations that I want to make known to my students. We today in 2023, we see elections always by the people, but remember that that in the beginning, state sovereignty, and it still is today, is a key component of the idea of having an electoral college. The states decide, and the states can determine how they will cast their votes, which I'm going to show you for president. Now, it's not as if to say that the people don't get to vote on election day. They do, but I'm going to show you before we're finished how that affects how a state casts their electoral votes. Some leverage is given to the smaller states. You may recall my mentioning and other professors mentioning that there was a lot of compromise going on. There was a lot of concern that the smaller states like New Jersey would leave. And what you have here, and not join the union, what you have here is really the result of a compromise. How can we give some leverage to the smaller states with a smaller population to keep them in union with the larger states? Okay, there was some serious concerns that some of these states, when we got rid of the Articles of Confederation, that first Constitution that we operated under, there was concern that the 13 states may actually not stay together, that they may form perhaps separate agreements with France and England and Spain, or perhaps we would not have 13 states joined together, but maybe 3 different regional countries or nations. All right, let's move along here. So the idea here is we're trying to keep the smaller states happy. And the Electoral College definitely gives some leverage to the smaller states. So let's crunch the numbers. You got these numbers up here, and I'm going to actually go through this pretty quickly. You can slow it down and think about this. You can pause it anytime you want. So these are the numbers: 435, 103, 538. What does all that mean? Well, I'm going to show you how each state gets to determine, how we determine how each state gets how many votes. So now we're looking at electoral votes. So these numbers here represent electoral votes, and we're going to divide these electoral votes between the states. So 435 equals the number of voting members in the U.S. House. You may remember that from our look at Congress. 100 equals the number of U.S. senators. We've known for a very long time that every state gets 2 U.S. senators. So 435, this number is proportion between the states based upon their population. 100, every state is equal. So remember that great compromise. And the bottom number really gives some leverage to the smaller, less populous states like Wyoming, Alaska, and Hawaii. 3 is a number of electoral votes awarded to the District of Columbia. You probably know that the District of Columbia is not actually part of a state. It's set aside. The Constitution allows Congress to designate a district for the federal government, and they chose a long time ago what we now call the District of Columbia. And the Constitution allows that Congress can award a number of electoral votes to the people within the District of Columbia. That would be what they would have if they were an actual state. And what you're looking at here with the number 3, it's a minimum. You have to have a minimum of 3 electoral votes, and this will make more sense as we move along here. So all of this, that means that on election day for president, 538 electoral votes are cast. That's why on election day, you always hear about 270. Why? Because 270 is a simple majority of 538, right? It's a little bit north of half of the number 538. All right, let's move along here. So let's say a couple other things about the Electoral College and what the Constitution has to say. Originally, in the Constitution, every person designated as an elector. So an elector is actually a human being. And the Electoral College is just a group of people. So electors cast two votes originally for two separate candidates to become president. One with the most votes became president. Now, I will say this, that the actual ratifying of the Constitution and the drafting of it just a couple years later was done really in a pre-political party world. Not as if I'm talking about in the U.S. And what do I mean by that? It means that when they put the Constitution together in 1787 and ratified it in 1789, political parties really hadn't put roots down yet. They knew what political parties were because they had political parties in the U.S. Smaller ones, but those political parties were related to ones that had existed in Great Britain at the time, like the Whigs and the Tories, just as an example. But the Constitution itself, our Constitution, was written in a pre-political party world. So it's in that original language, the electors on election day would cast their votes, and they would cast two separate votes. And at the end of the day, they didn't vote for a president and a vice president. They just selected two people from the ballot. Okay, they cast votes for two different people. Now, that led to some ties, and the way that it worked originally was whoever got the most votes became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. But that's changed. So after 1804, you can see it didn't take long. Really, just I guess about 15 years later, they added the 12th Amendment, and now on election day for president, electors cast a vote for president, and they cast a vote for vice president. All right, let's take a closer look at Texas now. So Electoral College is a group of people. It's made up of people that are referred to as electors. And we saw how we get 538, right? So the 435 plus 100 plus the 3, that's 538. Okay. Now, let's take a closer look at Texas and in the 2020 election. And now we're going to zero into into our own state, the state of Texas in 2020. So remember the numbers that I gave you. Out of that 435 members in the House, Texas had 36 of them in 2020. We have 38 now, but back then, just a few years ago, it was 36. That's 36 electoral votes Texas gets. And then we have 2 because that's the U.S. Senate, right? So notice how we get these figures. 36 equals the number of people that Texas had in the U.S. House, and 2 represents the number of people in the Senate that Texas had. So add those together, of course, and you get 38. So that's the total number of electoral votes cast by Texas in 2020. Okay. Now, with that in mind, because of the most recent census, the next time we have an election, Texas will have 40. Why? Because now, as in 2023, we have 38 members in the U.S. House. That 2 is still going to remain the same. Okay, so we'll actually be able to cast 40 electoral votes in 2024. But the last one, which is what our focus is on, is we had 38. So how it works in Texas. So in the summer of 2020, the two major political parties in Texas, the Democrats and Republicans, they held a convention, and this is typically the way that it works every summer. In fact, what I'm sharing with you all is out of the Texas election code. All right, so this is by law. This is law made by the state legislature, the Texas state legislature in Austin. The U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation of it basically gives a lot of leverage to states at the local level, state legislature level, to set up rules regarding how electors are chosen. So electors are human beings. Okay. All right. So let's go back to 2020. So in the summer of 2020, and every summer of presidential election years, the Democrats will have their their state convention. They'll choose one of the biggest cities in Texas, and the Republicans will have their state political party convention, and they'll choose one of the largest cities in Texas, and they'll have a convention. One of the most important things that they'll do, and they'll do many things, but one of the most important things that they will do, the two parties during that convention, is they will nominate 38 electors. What that means is that that out of each one of those two major parties, they will select 38 of their own. So the Democrats would choose 38 and the Republicans would choose 38. But they are not electors yet. They have to wait. So remember, we're talking about June, July, August, typically, where they're going to have these conventions and nominate 38 people. So 38 Republicans are nominated from their own party. 38 Democrats are nominated from their own party. Now, they're not electors yet. They're just nominees. So a few months later, we have the general election. And this is how we determine, or this is how the votes matter. So remember that these it's an indirect election. So we the people do not directly elect the president, but we indirectly elect the president. What do I mean by that? So what happens in Texas and all the other states is when the actual election takes place, the general election for president, where you have Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and Greenies running against each other in November, we have to keep a tally of the actual popular vote in Texas, okay? And the way that it works in Texas, and by the way, this is the way that it works in 48 other states, the way that it works in Texas is once we know which party's candidate got the majority of votes in Texas, so this is after the votes have been counted, the popular vote, the vote of we the people. The Secretary of State of Texas is required to officially announce how many votes went to the Republicans and how many votes went to the Democrats. If the Republicans win that contest of the popular vote, and the Democrats as well, since the Republicans won in 2020, there were more people in Texas who voted Republican than Democrat. Then what happened is, by way of the Texas election code, the Republicans, their nominees, those 38 nominated electors, they become electors. What happens to the 38 of the nominees by the Democrat? They go home. Okay? Their party lost the election. So now, once we know the official results of the popular vote in Texas, the Texas election code provides that party's nominees, that party's nominee for president of the United States will get all of Texas's electoral votes. That means those 38 electors that the Republican Party nominated and then got their position, they get to cast their votes, and they're going to, of course, for the most part, going to cast them for Republican, right? So when you get to December, that's when they actually cast their votes. Okay, I hope all this makes sense. So the parties nominate in the summer, and then we have the actual popular election in November, and then the Democrats had to go home because their party didn't get as many votes as Republicans, their nominees, they become electors, and then in December they will actually cast their electoral votes. They'll go to Austin and they'll cast their electoral votes. And then, of course, the tally is officially counted of all the electoral votes is counted by the Senate in January. You all may recall the January 6th incident in 2021. That was about some accusations of fraud in the casting of votes. Okay, so that's how it works in Texas. Now let me pause this just for a moment. Okay, what I have here is a map that shows you how these states cast their electoral votes in 2020. And I know that a lot of my students, particularly if they lean to the Democrat side, don't think that that's fair. But understand that the way that Texas does it, it's kind of I guess you could say it's a winner take all. So we cast 38 votes. So if you take a look at these states here, so this is 2020. Notice all of them in the blue. This number actually isn't correct. It should be 38 down here on Texas. That's because we had 36 plus the 2, so that's an incorrect number. Someone's jumping the gun on that. We have 40 now, but we won't actually cast those votes until 2024. But that aside, what you have here is the red represents the states that cast their votes for Republican, and the blue represents the states that cast their vote for Democrat. Let's take a look at California just for a moment. You see, because it's not as if no one cast their votes for Republicans. Donald Trump got a lot of votes in the state of California, but Joe Biden got more, and therefore California's law is very similar to Texas. It's a winner take all. Okay. In fact, Illinois, they've got about 40% of the people that cast their votes in Illinois are Republicans, but notice not a one of those electoral votes went for the Republican Party. That's because they also have a winner-take-all system at the state level. Whichever party wins the most votes gets that state's electoral college votes. Now, the only two exceptions would be Nebraska and Maine. So notice in Maine you have red and blue, and in Nebraska you have red and blue. Theirs is more proportionate. It's not directly proportional to the popular vote, but it's closer. So again, this is the way that Texas does it, and it's not as if we are some sort of minority. We're not. That's the way that 48 of the states do it. It's a winner take all, whether we're talking about Kansas, Colorado, Washington, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina. These are all winner take all. Whichever party's candidate gets the most votes in the popular election, that party's candidate will get all of that state's electoral votes. Now, to wrap it all up then, notice again something that I mentioned before. This is actually an election of the states. So in the beginning, or election by the states, in the beginning, this idea of state sovereignty was much stronger and much more clear than it is today. James Madison, as I've already said, considered the election of the president not to be really an election of the people, but an election by the states. It was part of the compromise that had to be made in order to keep all the states together. When states join the union, they understand this. That what they're doing is they're saying essentially, when a state joins the union, and they'd better study the Constitution, and I'm sure the leadership does very carefully. The person who is going to manage the executive branch of the federal government is decided not by the people directly, but by the states. And again, I hear a lot of folks complaining about how unfair that is. However, the only way that we would ever get rid of that is to actually change the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College and make the selection of the president based upon popular vote. Good luck doing that, because all those little bitty states like Nebraska and Wyoming and Oklahoma and Missouri and Iowa, Utah, Idaho, Montana, how many of them do you really think want to get rid of the Electoral College? I wouldn't say many, because they don't want to lose that leverage that they're given in the structure of the Electoral College in deciding who the president is. Okay, so that's all I've got to say there. Go back and make sure you read your textbook and listen to this video as many times as is necessary.